Right through the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s, we had become used to daily bombs, some terrible atrocities and shootings, and the sense that this would never end.
Every day having to listen to the news. There was a bomb here last night and so many people were killed.
Northern Ireland was a byword for conflict, for violence.
We were Brits out. Anti-partition was the sloganeering, but nothing was being done to deal with it. The ceasefire, the Downing Street Declaration between Albert Reynolds and John Major was just a major, major moment.
It's impossible to speak of Albert without smiling. We threw away any government briefs, any government matters that had to be discussed, and turned solely to the violence in Northern Ireland. And we both learned then that the other one wished to have an end to that violence as much as one did oneself. We equally understood that we may not get there within the time we were both in office. It may outrun us. What we were discussing was in many ways very controversial on both sides of the Irish border. And so there were fierce arguments from time to time, but it never affected the relationship.
I don't think I'll ever forget the meeting that we had in Downing Street on the day that we announced the Downing Street Declaration. I have a feeling that a lot of people thought it wouldn't happen. We were maybe halfway over the Irish Sea, and Albert said, "You know something," he said, "the last fellas that came over here," he said, "in the 20s, he said, I hope what happened to them doesn't happen to us." And suddenly that kind of made the whole thing real.
John Major and Albert Reynolds had built up a good relationship, and the Downing Street Declaration was hugely helpful to Tony and I.
That year when Bertie got elected was phenomenal in that I figured something different was going to happen. He came in with enthusiasm and energy and a great team, and likewise with Prime Minister Tony Blair. And I saw the chemistry.
Tony and I were new, so it was a bit, the kids, lunacy or vibrancy, whichever way you want to look at it, have a go anyway.
Over a long period of time, British and Irish governments had massive difficulties. I mean, they had often been in a bad relationship with each other. And in Bertie, I found a real soulmate.
We defended each other and we took lines, and that was, I think, the crucial part in that relationship.
The two governments working together, that's the key anchor to the peace process. Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair really got on very well, and a lot flowed from that trust that both had in each other. And then you had the American dimension and the European dimension.
Yeah, I met up with Bill in the mid-90s when I was leader of the opposition. He got on well with Tony got on well with me, so we both got on well with Bill. So it was a good team, it was a small team. We were able to work together in a collective way, and that's why we really got across the line and made it.
I mean, there really was nothing inevitable about it. When I got there, I remember George Mitchell saying to me, "I think this is pretty hopeless."
The plan was simple enough. He went to the north to reassure unionists that he was loyal to the union. After all the Thatcher years, it was important that he made that speech. My job was to convince Sinn Féin, to convince the IRA to get back into ceasefire. Our second challenge was to try and get the small loyalist parties to give cover to David Trimble, and to his eternal credit, he stayed in the talks, and people expect him to walk out, and that allowed us then to at least drive the process forward.
There's a lot of hurt in that room. First day I sat down, I looked around and realised that every single person at the table had suffered in different ways. Carl McMichael had lost his father. I had actually lost a very good friend as a student, and the party affiliated to that armed group was sitting next to me.
The levels of distrust were very, very deep. Trust
was in short supply. Confidence was in zero supply.
I had a meeting with David Trimble, and he just said to me, "It's the whole thing. It's every one of the strands. It's everything. This thing is completely unacceptable." Right at that moment, it was pretty bleak.
Trimble was beginning to become a bit nervous. His party held a meeting.
I assured him that I was prepared to move from our position. I then went to Sinn Féin and to SDLP to assure them that I hadn't thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Then I came back to my mother's funeral at 12 o'clock in Dublin, and after the graveyard went back again into the talks, you know, one day at a time.
It was touch and go. I mean, Clinton spent quite a bit of time talking to David Trimble.
Even in the last hours before we got the agreement, I mean, it was collapsing and getting resurrected again, almost, you know, minute by minute.
Mitchell himself had taken the view that he was going to call a halt to the whole thing if it didn't work out that particular Holy Week.
When the final call came through from David Trimble saying, you know, we can go with this, there was just this overwhelming sense of relief.
George Mitchell said, we think we have an agreement, we go around the table, and everyone agreed, and Sinn Féin said they consult, and that was the end. It was a wonderful moment.
I said, look, try and hold it together. Nobody should be crying because they'll say that's what women do. But I looked around the room and the men were crying too. And then it hit me just how incredible this moment was and what we had finally achieved.
The coming together of all the people of Ireland, achieved peacefully and by consent.
They brought to me a mobile phone and it was the Queen on the other line. And it was only when she was congratulating me and all the other people that had been engaged in the creation of the agreement that I remember thinking, wow, actually, this really is big.
That whole period was a sense of history in the making.
John Hume, an extraordinary man, and a lot of the things that we had in the Good Friday Agreement were John's ideas, and probably the biggest one, that the agreement should be put to the people north and south on a simultaneous referendum.
I went to bed that night thinking this was a Good Friday, but we have got to have lots more Good Fridays, especially for youngsters like that, who can only think of riots and murders and funerals and problems.
I can remember my first meeting as Minister of Education with Martin McGuinness as the Northern Ireland Minister of Education. I remember that well, where we discussed the policies we were doing. For him, it was a new journey meeting with Northern civil servants, which was a huge thing for him. And those early days were very exciting days, very exciting days.
The relationship I had with Mr. Brown, Gordon Brown, one followed on from the example of Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair. And he showed a huge commitment in various talks.
The chemistry between Brian Cowan and Gordon Brown was excellent also. And Brian, of course, had been Foreign Minister for a long period, and he was very much au fait with the situation in the North, and he had an excellent feel for the issues.
The relationship between the Dublin government and the London government, irrespective of the parties that were in office, was better in that period than at any time in 1,000 years of history.
It has been an island that's been flooded bloodshed for hundreds of years because of the conflicts, and there's a huge amount of work to do.
Building a more prosperous, inclusive and confident society.
The Shared Island essentially is about, without prejudice to people's constitutional preferences, saying to people, look, there's a whole range of issues where we can cooperate practically, and also to begin to understand, how do we share this island together? And there are no political overtones or connotations attached to it, and I think that's important. It's about really learning that piece about reconciliation.
Remember, the real victory is for constitutionalism in this process. The recognition that it will be the people of Ireland, it will be the people of the North in the first instance that will decide the constitutional status of the Northern Ireland.
Someone wrote to me 10 years after the agreement, a mother who I didn't meet. She put her letter through my front door and she said, I want to thank you for what you've done. My 3 children now can aspire to something that I could have only once dreamed of. And to me, those were the most uplifting words I ever heard.
The Good Friday Agreement is an example of the best of politics in action. Things did change, and they changed for the better.
I'm very struck by, I think it's the late John F. Kennedy said, President Kennedy said, we can achieve peace, but achieving a peace is not enough in itself. We've got to tend to peace. You've got to nurture the peace. You've got to look after the peace. I think it's critical that as we look back and celebrate what happened, that we pivot quickly to the future and look at the economic, political, social and cultural opportunities that arise and really go for it now for the next decade or two.